Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 230, Ottoman High Tide. Last time we followed the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent as he continued to press his borders further and further. While Suleiman failed to take the city of Vienna, it proved to be the weather and the distance that thwarted him, not European military superiority. Once upon a time, Constantinople had been too far. Its walls too thick, its climate too difficult. Now that city is called Istanbul. Much could still change. Suleiman also worked to reform the Ottoman legal code, creating provincial laws better able to respond to the needs of local peoples. This time, Suleiman again has to deal with the Habsburgs in Europe, while internal court intrigue threatens to derail the Ottoman High Command from within. In October 1530, a delegation arrived in Istanbul. They had come from Ferdinand, brother of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. The delegation included the hereditary Chamberlain of Croatia and a major nobleman from Styria. Their task? Get Suleiman to give back Hungary. Back in Hungary, things were not going well for Ferdinand. The nobles who had supported him were beyond frustrated. In no uncertain terms, they made it clear to the Habsburg would-be monarch that they never would have split with the supporters of Zapuljai, the preferred Ottoman candidate for the throne, and current possessor of said crown, had they known that Ferdinand was going to make absolutely no effort, or practically no effort, to drive the Turks from their lands. For his part, Ferdinand consistently pestered and begged his brother to help him do just that. But Charles was far too consumed by his incessant wars with Francis I and his religious issues in Germany to do anything to help his brother. Moreover, the Ottoman corsair/pirate Barbarossa had now taken Algiers and dominated the central Mediterranean. No, Charles told his brother. He wanted Austria and Hungary. Fine. But then he, Ferdinand, would have to deal with it. The delegation first met with Ibrahim Pasha, the chief vizier. They tried bribery. It didn't work. They tried to purchase Hungary. Ibrahim turned and pointed to the Castle of the Seven Towers, where the royal treasury was kept, and said it was overflowing. Suleiman didn't want more gold. Finally, the men were admitted to see the Sultan, where they made a royal mess of things. Haughty to the end, the Habsburg ambassadors argued Hungary rightfully belonged to Ferdinand. Why? Well, I'm not sure. Regardless, Suleiman was not buying it. No, he responded, he was not returning a kingdom, quote, twice conquered by our arms. Suleiman frankly had no desire for peace on his western border. He saw Charles V as his only true adversary. He wanted a war that would draw the emperor in so that the Sultan might defeat him once and for all. A peace with Ferdinand would be antithetical to that goal. If Charles would not come out willingly, then Suleiman would provoke him. On April the 25th, 1532, the Sultan once more set out toward the Danube. This time, he commanded an army of 100,000 men, including 12,000 elite janissaries, 30,000 Anatolian soldiers, many of them cavalry, and 36,000 auxiliary, drawn from across the realm. For some reason, Ferdinand decided to send another delegation to meet Suleiman on the march and offer cash again for Hungary, despite the fact that Suleiman had already turned down such an offer, and that was before he spent the resources mobilizing his army. Oddly, the negotiators first offered 25,000 ducats, and then just jumped straight to 100,000 ducats when Suleiman said no, illustrating that they really needed to take a masterclass on negotiation. It didn't matter. Suleiman turned him down again, saying, quote, "The King of Spain has long said that he wants to take on the Turks. Well, by the grace of God, I am now on my way to meet him with my army. If he is great-hearted, let him wait for me on the field of battle, and then let the will of God be done. If he has no desire to meet me, let him send a tribute to my imperial majesty." End quote. Suleiman did not get to meet Charles in battle, but he did clash with the forces of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles created a brief window of opportunity by signing the Peace of Nuremberg, which granted religious toleration to Protestants in exchange for helping fighting the Ottomans. As we know, he would later regret that decision and recant his clemency. Because he didn't have to worry about Germany for the moment, Charles was able to send some Spanish and Italian contingents to Vienna for the defense of Austria. The main battle took place near Gunz, modern-day Kozeg, which is about 80 miles southeast of Vienna. Suleiman had easily reduced the petty string of defenses in southern Hungary, but the effort had delayed him. The main Ottoman army, led by Ibrahim Pasha, did not reach Gunz until April the 9th, 1532. Amazingly, the town, garrisoned by only 800 men, held out. Even after the Ottomans pounded the town with artillery and launched several waves of attackers, the garrison resisted. Suleiman demanded that the commander in charge of the town surrender and pay an annual tribute. He responded he didn't have that kind of cash, and regardless, the town belonged to Ferdinand, so it wasn't his to give up. In accordance with Islamic law, Suleiman made the offer 3 times, and it was rejected. Ibrahim immediately launched an attack with the Janissaries, his elite troops. But somehow, in a fight that even the women and the children, apparently, participated in, they were thrown back again. Both sides thought the outcome was nothing less than a miracle. The Turks who fought claimed that they saw a heavenly knight galloping upon the ramparts, slaying Ottomans left and right. No comment as to the accuracy of that. Ibrahim was by now deeply impressed with the town's commander. He promised him safe conduct if the man would come and see him in his camp. The commander agreed, recognizing he was now out of gunpowder and down to only 400 men. Ibrahim offered the man generous terms, and he consented. With Gunz taken, Suleiman could now move on to Vienna directly. In Vienna, meanwhile, everyone was feverishly preparing for a siege. But then Suleiman shocked everyone and marched east instead, towards Styria. Styria, not Syria, is a region in the southeast of modern-day Austria, centered around the town of Graz. Suleiman, taking half of the army with him, ravaged through Styria, though he failed to take any major town, including Graz. After a month, he returned to Belgrade to link up with Ibrahim and the rest of the army. By November the 18th, 1532, the Sultan was back in Istanbul. While 5 days of games attempted to play off the whole affair as a victory, the reality was the campaign had been a setback. The siege of Gunz had cost Suleiman too much time, rendering another siege of Vienna impossible. His efforts to pillage the countryside and thereby draw Charles V into a conflict in a place that gave the advantage to the Ottoman cavalry didn't work. Perhaps Charles would not take the bait, but more likely because he had other important matters, in his mind, to attend to. Unable to face his great enemy on land, Suleiman grew determined to oppose Charles in the Mediterranean. The contest between the two men at sea was fought primarily between their 2 chief naval lieutenants. The Genoese prince Andrea Doria led the imperial navy, and Kahir ad-Din, better known as Barbarossa due to his red beard, commanded the Ottoman fleet. Both men were exceptional tacticians and leaders. Suleiman was 100% committed to winning the Mediterranean. By the middle of the 16th century, the Ottomans had a larger fleet than all the other Mediterranean countries put together. In 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto, the Ottomans would command 300 ships. By comparison, Venice would send 120, Genoa 25, the Pope 12, Spain perhaps 75, and France nothing. Still, back in 1534, both the Ottomans and the imperial side wanted peace. Both realized that they were on the precipice of a struggle that would last for the balance of the 16th century. For the moment, both kingdoms needed rest. Moreover, Suleiman wanted to turn east and deal with the Persians, a campaign I recounted in the last episode. And here, if you're a fan of Western Europe, you have to shake your head in disappointment. If you are an Ottoman fan, this will be music to your ears. Charles and Ferdinand could never get on the same page about whether there should be a universal peace treaty with the Ottomans and what it should look like. Case in point, in 1534, both men sent peace delegations to Istanbul. Ferdinand's delegation indicated he was willing to do homage to Suleiman to hold on to Hungary. Charles' emissaries demanded Hungary be returned in exchange for a minor Aegean town. They were both literally negotiating against one another, though ostensibly they represented the same general side. Cue audible sigh. In the end, Suleiman signed the deal he liked better, the one with Ferdinand. By signing an agreement only with Ferdinand, it shored up his western front in Central Europe, allowing him to pursue a war against the Safavids in Persia, while not binding him to anything with Charles. Suleiman's peace with Ferdinand didn't say anything about Charles's holdings. He was free to ravage and pillage in the Mediterranean as he saw fit, but he didn't have to worry about any Habsburg incursions from Hungary. It's one of the diplomatic blunders of history that just leaves you scratching your head. I covered the Safavid campaign last time, so here's just a brief reminder. Ibrahim Pasha crossed into Persia, the Shah retreated. He captured Baghdad. Suleiman was pleased. He advanced again, the Shah retreated. Eventually, the two sides signed a treaty, recognizing Ottoman gains up to Baghdad, but keeping the rest of what was traditionally Iran under Safavid control. At the beginning of January 1536, Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, was back in Istanbul. In fact, on February the 18th, Ibrahim signed a peace treaty with France on behalf of Suleiman. A month later, he was dead. On the morning of March 15th, 1536, Ibrahim Pasha's lifeless body was discovered in the palace, in the bedroom next to where the Sultan slept. The fall of the Grand Vizier and the circumstances of said fall soon became known and hit the Ottoman world like a bombshell. There was much speculation as to why Suleiman, and it had to have been him, would have gotten rid of his right-hand man. Unfortunately, if the Sultan did give his reasons to anyone, the historical record does not report it. Had Ibrahim betrayed Suleiman in some way? That seems highly unlikely. Ibrahim had nearly as much power as the Sultan himself. There just wasn't any rung on the ladder higher to go except to attempt a coup. We have no information that Ibrahim had designs on the throne, and if he did, and there was evidence of it, the record wouldn't be silent. We have no information that Ibrahim was going to betray Suleiman to Charles or Francis or anyone else for that matter. And again, if there was evidence of an attempted betrayal, Suleiman wouldn't have been silent about it. He wanted to give an explanation as to why he did what he did. So what gives? The most likely explanation is Roxlane, Suleiman's favorite European wife. We know that Roxlane and Ibrahim were often on opposite sides when it came to policy decisions. Given how rife the Ottoman court was with intrigue, I think it's reasonable to conclude that she adopted a "it's either him or me" strategy in order to save herself, her sons, one of whom she definitely expected to be Sultan someday. Roxlane probably felt like she had to get rid of Ibrahim Pasha. Regardless, in March of 1536, the Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, exits our story. Istanbul would have been rife with rumors, and rumors could be dangerous. Very dangerous. Going all the way back to the emperors of Byzantium, the capital city could potentially break a ruler. Just because the Ottomans had changed the name to Istanbul, they didn't change that reality. Istanbul remained a large city with a diverse population. Rumors spread like lightning, and the situation was all the more tenuous because of the proximity of the Janissaries. They were a potential powder keg, and if a rumor hit at the right time, the whole thing might blow. Moreover, even a demonstration by the people could turn extremely dangerous if the military decided to intervene on the part of the people. After all, there was no guarantee that the military would side with the Sultan. Sometimes the mere fact that the Sultan was away for too long might be enough to provoke discontent. The Sultans were also particularly wary of religious leaders who might easily stir up trouble. This was especially true in the provinces, where a revolt might smolder for weeks or even months before the Sultan could get to it. Suleiman went to great lengths to quash even the possible accusation of violating any of the precepts of Islam. Every Friday, he went to say his prayers in solemn state. Every feast of sacrifice, he ordered 3,000 sheep to have their throats ritualistically slit. Each year, the departure of the pilgrimage to Mecca was celebrated. The Sultan did everything that he could to show that he was the perfect Muslim, that he was the true leader of the faithful. And to an extent, it is possible that Suleiman's desire to play up his commitment to Islam contributed to the fall of Ibrahim. Ibrahim was no religious zealot. He wasn't even pious. Frankly, he often refused to conceal his contempt for some of the traditional precepts of Islam. Ibrahim was cut out of the same mold as Mehmet II. He wanted a secular Ottoman state that ruled as the true successor to Alexander the Great. He wanted to bring back Hellenism, not Islam. He put up statues banned by the Quran in full view in Istanbul. He made no effort to conceal his pride at his accomplishments. Suleiman, one argument goes, could not remain deaf to the cries of Ibrahim the idolater, Ibrahim the heretic. In the end, Ibrahim's death passed like so many of those quote-unquote irreplaceable men before him. That is to say, in time, he was forgotten. Another Grand Vizier, Ayas Pasha, was appointed in his place, and the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent rolled on. The death of Ibrahim Pasha and the capture of Baghdad represent the end of the first phase of Suleiman's reign, at least according to most historians. The age of the Great Expansion, the Great Conquests, was over. Baghdad was in Ottoman hands. Much of Central Europe was in Ottoman hands. What other conquests remained were already underway in the Aegean, North Africa, and the Red Sea. The fortunes of the Ottoman Empire would wax and wane over the coming centuries. Provinces would be lost and retaken. Yet nothing would match Suleiman's first decade and a half of great conquering. More than 15 years had passed since Suleiman's first incursions in Central Europe. Belgrade and Buda were now in Ottoman control. Suleiman's troops had twice marched on Vienna. It seemed like nothing other than treacherous supply routes and bad weather could stop him. Still, despite the ominous threat Suleiman posed, Charles was determined he was not going to get dragged into a decisive confrontation around the Danube. He was too busy fighting Francis, Henry sometimes, and most importantly, his Protestant German subjects. And he told his brother as much. Ferdinand was on his own. Moreover, while Charles might dream of driving the Ottomans from Europe, he knew that this would always remain a dream. He did not possess the power to do it on his own. Plus, he recognized that no one was going to turn over to him the reins of kingdoms like France and England, and their forces that would be necessary to once and for all drive the Sultan from Europe. Francis was, in fact, actively communicating and conspiring with Suleiman. Charles V believed that the decisive event would take place somewhere other than Hungary, most likely in the Mediterranean. When they first came to power, neither Charles nor Suleiman had major fleets to put to sea. The Ottomans had everything they needed to build a fleet, but they lacked an admiral to put at the helm. The Spanish won several minor victories in the Western Mediterranean over the Ottomans in the early to mid-1520s, but they were unable to follow up on these successes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, everything changed when the two great admirals of the era came to power, Andrea Doria and Barbarossa. In 1520, Andrea Doria was over 50 years old, and he was a member of the most important aristocratic family in Genoa. Doria had originally planned to fight for Francis I, until Francis had managed to insult him, driving away his best admiral in a way that only Francis could. Charles was only too happy to scoop him up. Barbarossa was the son of a Greek potter who had, at an early age, converted to Islam so as to reap the benefits of the new ruling party. He was, however, a pirate in nearly every sense of the word. Barbarossa also had a brother who would have a part to play in our story, though a much smaller one. Early on in the 1520s, the Barbarossa brothers moved their pirate operation to the Barbary coast, along what is today Tunisia. In short order, the brothers murdered the Sultan of Algiers and the King of Tunis, taking control over both kingdoms and paying fealty to Suleiman in Istanbul. They might have been pirates, but they were no fools. The Spanish, incensed by the capture of Algiers, dispatched a 100,000-man force to retake the city. They did, and Barbarossa's brother was killed. From that point on, Barbarossa would do everything in his power to destroy the Spanish and avenge the death of his brother. Barbarossa quickly realized that only a great power could dominate all the small Islamic fiefdoms that dotted the Mediterranean coast, an area that's often referred to as the Maghreb. Thus, Barbarossa immediately swore fealty to the Ottomans at the time of Selim I in 1518. In return for his loyalty, Barbarossa got the men and materials he truly needed to contest the Spanish in the Western Mediterranean. The Ottomans were determined to ensure that they could still trade in the Mediterranean. This was a very real concern. In the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese were pushing the Ottomans out of the lucrative spice trade. It was all well and good that Selim was able to seize Egypt, but the port of Alexandria meant very little if there was nowhere to take the goods from there. Thus, the Sultan needed to flex his naval muscles in the Mediterranean or risk losing an extremely lucrative tax base. As a result, no one was under any illusions that a major confrontation was coming between the Ottomans and Charles V for control over the Mediterranean trade lanes. By 1529, Suleiman wanted to expel the Spanish from Algiers. Charles responded by granting the Knights of the Hospital, now in Malta, the task of guarding the Straits of Sicily and, as a consequence, Algiers. They probably weren't overly pleased with the assignment. Then, he sent Andrea Doria to seize Lepanto in the southern Peloponnese in the hope of bottling up the Ottomans in the eastern Mediterranean. Unfortunately, for the Ottomans, for the moment they were outgunned. The ships that they had were those who had fought the Venetians at the end of the 15th century, and far too old to be of any major use. With Doria so close, Suleiman became concerned that the Spanish might strike at the Dardanelles. Hence, in 1533, he called on Barbarossa to take up his cause. Appointed Chief Admiral of the Ottoman Navy, Barbarossa assembled a powerful fleet in just a few months. He succeeded in recapturing Lepanto, Andrea Doria was gone by then, and reasserted Ottoman supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. This is actually when Francis I asked Suleiman, via Barbarossa, to make a landing in Italy. All Barbarossa would do, however, was raid Calabria and the Neapolitan coast. Then he seized Tunis, giving the Ottomans an even better base than Algiers for attacking the western Mediterranean. Charles now felt the heat rising. If he did nothing, he would completely lose the eastern Mediterranean plus potentially Sicily and Naples as well. Even Spain might be in jeopardy. He needed a strong counter-thrust to drive the Ottomans back to the eastern Mediterranean. At this point, even Charles realized he would not be able to wrest that half of the sea from Suleiman. This was about containment. Charles himself decided he would lead the expedition. He would not meet Suleiman in battle south of the Danube, but he would strike at Barbarossa. Charles mustered 412 ships in all under the command of the intrepid Andrea Doria, plus a solid army of 27,000 men. To stop him, Barbarossa had a few thousand troops and less than 60 galleys. The battles fought were not significant. Charles easily retook Tunis. Barbarossa, for his part, recognized that he simply did not have the men to contest the imperial advance. From Tunis, Charles moved on to Algiers, which fell as well. The imperial troops were merciless, killing 30,000 and enslaving another 10. Charles had no intention of ruling Algiers himself. He restored Moulay Hassan, who became Charles's vassal and was given a garrison of 1,000 Spanish soldiers. Hassan agreed to the terms, as well as to pay an annual tribute of 12,000 crowns. The conquest of Tunis made quite the stir in Europe. Hitherto, many had seen Suleiman as invincible. Granted, Charles had not taken on the Sultan directly, but he had still beaten his best admiral. Christendom wondered what Charles might do next. Would he continue to pursue his foe into Greece, even Istanbul? Charles, however, was not as naive as some of his counterparts. He knew the capture of Tunis proved nothing. Even Barbarossa was far from vanquished. That fall, the admiral raided the Balearic Islands and the coast of Valencia. In the end, the main effect of the Spanish counterattack on Tunis was only to accelerate Turkish naval preparations. For the whole of 1536, the dockyards of the Golden Horn hummed and worked at a feverish pace. Suleiman himself supervised the construction. Quote, "Twice a day he, Suleiman, went to the arsenal and the places where the guns were cast to hasten and encourage the work." End quote. Suleiman might have gotten a little older, but he was as hands-on as ever. Terrifying rumors swept Europe throughout the winter of 1536-37. The Pope considered leaving Rome. Southern Italy was, quote, in a marvelous state of fear. That spring, 200 new ships sailed out of Istanbul. What shocked the Western world more than the size of this fleet was the speed with which it was constructed. Western Europe took years to build its fleets, decades even. The Ottomans had done it in 3 months. Not only was the Ottoman treasury virtually bottomless under Suleiman, but the far-flung parts of the empire could supply everything the Sultan needed. Another great advantage, for now, the Ottomans had was that one person made all the decisions. Charles might want to build up his navy, but he had to negotiate with the Spanish nobility, the German princes, let's say the Genoese, to do it. Even Andrea Doria had a choice as to who he would support, Charles or Francis. Push him too far, Charles well understood, and he might lose his services altogether. In other words, and this is the key, Suleiman was an emperor in every sense of the word. Charles was not. He had a title, and to a large extent, that was about it. In terms of the nuts and bolts of ship construction, while the materials might have come from across the empire, the ships themselves were constructed, by and large, in and around Istanbul. Galata, across the Golden Horn from the city, contained more than 120 covered docks in 1550, in which 2 ships could be laid down or sheltered from the weather. Boats could also be constructed at the entrance to the Dardanelles at Gallipoli. Within only a few months using all of these resources, the Ottomans had put together a significant fleet. Critically, in late 1536, Cyprus fell into Ottoman hands. Previously a Venetian colony, Cyprus was just the latest major Western enclave in the Eastern Mediterranean to fall into Ottoman hands, frankly. It was the last. Now all that remained was Venetian Crete. Its loss meant that there was very little to stop Suleiman from pressing westward. In May of 1537, Suleiman made his ambitions clear. He set out with his 2 sons, Mehmed and Selim, for the Albanian coast. It was the closest place in his empire to Italy. The fleet was to follow under the command of the intrepid Barbarossa. The aim of the expedition was to capture Brindisi, which controlled the road to Perugia, and then Naples, and then Rome. Technically, Francis had agreed to join in on the endeavor and simultaneously march on Milan. While it's interesting to wonder what would have happened had he done so, as usual, and as we know, Francis changed his mind and failed to carry through on his end of the bargain. Suleiman, as a result, was forced to turn back. Without French support, he didn't want to risk a major confrontation in Italy. So even after landing in Valona, in Albania, he ordered his men back to the boats. Instead, they would attack Corfu, an island on the western coast of Greece, currently under the control of Venice. Now, for a long time now, Venice had tried its best to play a very difficult balancing game when it came to the Ottomans. They always had to appear anti-Islamic in Europe. But Venice understood that it couldn't go to war with the Ottomans if it didn't have major allies. The Venetians were simply unable of prosecuting a war for a long time. They would have been starved to death without wheat from Egypt, the Balkans, or Sicily. Theirs was a maritime republic, and one that depended on grain from abroad to feed itself. For a long time, the Ottoman Empire had been the only existential threat facing Venice. As a result, Venetian policy had long been to accommodate the Sultan, no matter the cost. For the most part, this policy worked well. The Venetian Doge was the only European sovereign to get letters of victory from the Sultan, and the only European often invited to great festivities at the Ottoman palace. Since the peace of 1502, no major incident had come between the two countries. But the Venetians were no fools. They steadfastly maintained their island defenses and their fleet. And the Venetian arsenal was the premier naval force of its day. Venice took advantage of every technological advantage, always sure to remain one step ahead. The problem was for Venice, the loss of Ibrahim Pasha cost them their number one ally within the Ottoman court. And so it was in late 1537. Barbarossa laid waste to the area around Otranto, while Suleiman attacked Venetian Corfu. And Suleiman was serious about taking the island. He landed 50,000 men and 50 cannons on an island so tiny it could hardly accommodate that many people. However, when it became apparent that the citadel would only yield after a lengthy siege, the Ottomans withdrew. Corfu had, after all, been in Venetian hands for 150 years, and they had spent that time reinforcing its substantial fortifications. But the critical effect of the war was that it shattered Venetian understanding with the Ottomans. And from then on, Venice agreed to participate in a holy league against the Ottomans, joining forces with the papacy and Charles V. Their participation in this alliance proved disastrous and short-lived. The Venetians quickly ran out of food, and by 1539 were forced to sue for peace. Their participation proved costly. While they were able to defend Venice itself, Barbarossa went on an offensive spree in the Aegean, gobbling up 25 islands previously under Venetian control. Europe was stunned, again, by Barbarossa's campaign. Why? I'm not sure. You would think that Europe would have woken up to the Ottoman threat by now, but I guess not. Regardless, Barbarossa's complete subjugation of 25 Christian islands in little over a year was yet another example of just what the Sultan was capable of. Those countries closest to the growing storm, especially the Venetians, felt the danger most acutely. During the brief period of cooperation of the Holy League, the Europeans had once again become way too optimistic. The Pope and Charles V even sat down and decided how best to divide up the Ottoman Empire after they conquered it. Those expectations were a tad too aggressive. After the debacle of 1538-39, Charles decided he would just try and bribe Barbarossa. Barbarossa was game, but he wanted the entire North African coast. Charles offered him a few towns in Tripoli. Barbarossa wasn't having it. He wasn't about to betray Suleiman for a pittance. The bigger problem, however, with this alliance and the European war aims is that they were never the same. Charles was never totally committed to destroying the Ottoman fleet. He wasn't willing to risk his own ships, and as a result, potentially the safety of the Western Mediterranean, on one grand throw of the dice. In early autumn 1538, an imperial fleet, commanded by Andrea Doria, had Barbarossa surrounded near Actium, where Cleopatra and Mark Antony's ambitions met their end roughly 1,500 years earlier. But Doria did not attack. Why not? Well, the most likely answer is that Charles felt the opportunity wasn't worth the risk, even though Barbarossa was badly outnumbered. In the end, Charles and Suleiman never fought that grand battle on land or sea, probably because Suleiman and Charles just had massively different priorities. The emperor's heart was always in Western Europe. So long as that was secure from the Sultan, well, that was enough. The end result of all this was that Suleiman had definitively beaten a coalition of Charles the Pope in Venice and now effectively ruled all the Mediterranean east of Italy and across the coast of North Africa. Charles in the west responded to the new threat for now by digging in. Sicily was the next logical Ottoman target. If Sicily fell to Suleiman, well, then all the western Italian coast would be open to Barbarossa's incursions. Charles, as the king of the two Sicilies, quickly set to work developing a series of fortifications designed to defend the island from attack. He placed hundreds of watchtowers along the coast and stocked local garrisons with men and supplies. Charles might not have been overly interested in that grand showdown with Suleiman in Eastern Europe, but he certainly was not about to lose any more ground in the Western Mediterranean. Spanish and Sicilian efforts to shore up coastal defenses continued throughout the 16th century and, by and large, were effective. What this illustrates is that the balance of power in Europe was, at this moment, decisively in favor of the Ottomans and Suleiman. Europe simply could not match Turkish organizational prowess or their artillery. It would take Europe the better part of 100 years to catch up, and by then it would be the Russians who, by and large, became the leading threat to the Sultan. For now, Suleiman was ascendant. By 1540, everyone was certain that the Sultan was planning for another assault. Charles waited, trying to see what his next target would be. Lacking the necessary European unity to strike first, Charles remained on the defensive. But where would Suleiman strike? Would he return to Hungary? Or would he press across the Mediterranean, all the way to Spain? Everyone waited to see. Charles began 1540 feverishly preparing for an Ottoman assault on the Western Mediterranean. While Charles considered whether or not to launch a preemptive assault that October, Andrea Doria and others urged him to wait for the spring. Ferdinand, Charles's brother, kept shouting as loudly as he could that the real threat was to Vienna and Hungary, but to no avail. Charles waited all winter for the Ottomans to advance, but Suleiman stayed put. By then, his naval forces were assembled, and Charles decided to attack Algiers. But by the time Charles came to that decision, it was the end of August 1541. Doria cautioned Charles that he had missed the window and it was too late to begin any sort of an assault. But Charles wouldn't hear it. He had 500 ships ready to transport 12,000 men. Even Spanish now hero Hernán Cortés came along for the ride. In Algiers, Barbarossa's son commanded about 800 Turkish soldiers and maybe 5,000 local militiamen. As we know, it should have been a cakewalk for the Spanish, but it turned into a nightmare. The Spaniards failed to prepare for the landing. While there was an excellent natural harbor to the east of the city, Charles decided to land much closer to the walls. The problem was that this left the ships lashed by the winds and rains of the ocean. Before long, said ships broke loose from their moorings and began to crash into one another. It didn't get much better on land. Charles arrayed his forces in 3 columns before the walls. But the torrential rains began to fall. It was now late October, and an orderly advance became impossible. The Italian contingent advanced but fell back. The Germans fled without fighting. 2 days later, Charles found himself soaked, less 1,200 men, and short 160 boats. Charles turned to prayer to solve his problems. Doria banged his head against a wall in frustration. Finally, Charles decided he had to retreat. Even then, the retreat was a disaster. The Ottomans rushed the retreating troops who scattered in a panic. Charles himself was nearly captured. What should have been a slam dunk for the emperor turned into yet another victory for Suleiman. While for Charles and Ferdinand, Suleiman remained the permanent enemy of Christendom, the Sultan himself was smart enough to know that there were many more kingdoms in Europe who did not see the Ottomans as the main threat. France and England were much less interested in the Mediterranean trade than Charles. Honestly, when it came to allies, he could actually count that Charles's list was rather short. I mean, Charles had Venice, consistently, the Pope, consistently, and that was about it. Suleiman intimately understood how divided Europe was, maybe even more so than Charles, and sought to consistently exploit that division. Suleiman rarely saw himself in the role of arch-villain like Charles did. His interests were much more local. For example, in 1538, Moldavia refused to pay tribute, so Suleiman marched off to teach it a lesson. The Ottomans made quick work of the wayward Moldavians, and within a few months the Sultan, behind 8,000 men, crushed any resistance and burnt their capital to the ground. While this was a minor incident, it's a good reminder that Suleiman remained far more interested in the Balkans than advancing on far-off Spain. While Charles and others might worry about an Ottoman attack on Barcelona or the Balearic Islands, such an ambitious plan was never on Suleiman's radar. As a result of the conquest of Moldavia, the Ottomans now controlled all the territory along the Dniester River that runs through modern-day Moldavia into the Ukraine. But to everyone watching in Hungary, it was obvious that the offensive into Moldavia had been merely a prelude. Suleiman remained happy to use any excuse to expand his borders into Central Europe. Relations between Ferdinand and the Ottoman government remained poor. Ferdinand, who had had to renounce the Hungarian crown previously, was increasingly agitating for more authority over the Hungarian nobility. The powder keg was ready to blow. Said powder keg blew in July of 1540, when John Zapuljai, the present ruler of Hungary, the man essentially given the job by Suleiman, died. Suleiman's immediate problem was that Zapuljai and Ferdinand had signed a secret treaty specifying that while the two men lived, each would rule their respective portions of Hungary. However, when one or the other died, and if they died without an heir, then Hungary would go to the remaining member of the partnership. In 1539, Zapuljai had married Isabella of Poland, who quickly became pregnant. Less than 2 weeks before Zapuljai died, Isabella gave birth to a son, named John Sigismund. Thus, we have ourselves a tricky situation. Ferdinand went right ahead and asserted that he was the rightful king of Hungary, issuing a bizarre and absurd statement that the child was not Isabella's, and some kind of imposter put in place to deprive him of his rightful inheritance. I mean, okay, bud, pretty sure Isabella would know if she gave birth, but whatever. Many nobles, including the powerful bishop of Nagyvarad, did not relish the prospect of Habsburg domination over Hungary, and instead looked to the child and a certain lengthy regency to keep Ferdinand out. But the infant was barely a week old. There was no guarantee that he was going to survive. To the Sultan, it was out of the question that the Habsburg should gain control over Hungary. Suleiman, really annoyed he did not know about the treaty between Zapulai and Ferdinand, dispatched an emissary to first establish that Isabella's son did, in fact, exist. He did. Suleiman, via his ambassador, immediately agreed to support Isabella. He almost certainly was going to, no matter what. After all, it was not in his interest to see Ferdinand as the king of Hungary. Almost immediately after Suleiman's representatives left, however, Ferdinand advanced on and then laid siege to Buda, forcing Isabella to flee, son in tow. Suleiman was furious. When Ferdinand's emissary arrived to discuss the matter, he nearly had the man's ears and nose cut off. At this point, it's clear Suleiman was determined to annex Hungary. He had had enough of Habsburg machinations and treacherous vassals. So in the late summer of 1541, Suleiman marched out from Istanbul at the head of yet another army, determined to take Buda and restore Ottoman control once and for all. While he was spoiling for a fight, once again, Charles did not rise to take the bait. What started out as a military campaign for the Sultan turned into much more of a jaunty stroll. The kingdoms of Bosnia and Serbia sided with Isabella and sent forces to augment the sultans. Before long, Suleiman and his son, Prince Bayezid, were camped outside the walls of Buda. There, Suleiman met with Isabella and the year-old prince. He took one look at the boy and informed all present he had decided to incorporate Hungary into the Ottoman Empire. Isabella was probably disappointed, but I sincerely doubt she was shocked. Buda put up little resistance. On September the 2nd, 1541, Suleiman made his solemn entrance into the town. Isabella and her son would be allowed to remain in Buda as figureheads, but Hungary would be under the direct control of an Ottoman governor, and would remain so for 150 years or so, until 1699. Ferdinando, God bless him, did not stop trying to purchase Hungary. Now his ambassadors offered 100,000 ducats per year in tribute if Suleiman would recognize him as king. But his ambassadors didn't even get an audience with the Sultan. In fact, Suleiman responded to this request/demand by marching out from Istanbul for the 8th time, with the intention of completely subjugating all of Hungary, even those vassals who remained stubbornly loyal to Ferdinand. Throughout the summer of 1542, Suleiman marched up and down the Danube, taking town after town, stronghold after stronghold. Valpovo, on the right bank of the Danube, held out for a bit, so Suleiman unleashed his artillery, reportedly lobbing 3,137 stone cannonballs at the town. Its defenses crumbled, and its humbled population submitted. By July the 23rd, Suleiman was back in Buda. With fall approaching, he made for Gran, the spiritual capital of Hungary. It only took 3 days and hundreds more cannonballs to reduce the city. One cannonball reportedly struck the top of the cathedral within the city. 2 days later, Suleiman said his prayers in that same building, now a mosque. By the end of September, Suleiman was headed back to Istanbul. He had now decisively beaten his enemies in Hungary. Charles had not deigned to meet him in battle, but at this point, Suleiman did not care. Hungary belonged to him. As always, if you're interested in more content, check out the links in the show notes. You can head to the website at westerncivpodcast.com. Think about becoming a patron for additional content and ad-free versions of the show for as little as $1 a month. Or check out a free trial of Western Civ Podcast 2.0. We've now revisited the Persian Wars and are marching inexorably towards further Greek conflict in the Peloponnesian War. Again, free trial, check it out. Link in the show notes.